Okay, so I'm going to start with two artworks on the screen. The one on your left is by Jacques-Louis David, and it shows Napoleon crossing the Alps. What we see here is a glorious depiction of Napoleon crossing the northern Italian states after a series of lightning raids, and he's celebrating a bloody victory. And we can see the dramatic landscape behind him, the romantic glamour of war, with a flying French flag over there. It's a very simple message that this canvas is telling the viewer. It's telling you imperialism is power and power is glory. Support Napoleon for the glory of the French Republic. Centuries afterwards, and the mood could not be more different in this artwork, this is what war feels like in the modern age, according to British artist William Turnbull. What we see here is a landscape which is imagined post-nuclear attack. This is a landscape which has been stripped of its glamour, of its glory, of the romance, and it's just nothingness. This is how war is imagined in the modern age. I begin my lecture by contrasting these two artworks as a teaser for what is to come. Hopefully from this juxtaposition, I've already demonstrated to you how art can provide many different ways of seeing the world, but these two in particular are two different perspectives of war, glory versus horror and nothingness. This is very important because we can recite the destructive means of war using conventional linguistic techniques. For example, you may recite how many millions of people could be killed during a specific war. But art actually allows us to imagine and kind of picture how this feels. It adds a human element. And this is very important because this lecture is primarily going to argue that art can give conflict and war a human face. And I hope to inspire you during this lecture to incorporate images into your own work. Use them as source materials, a way to broaden and enhance your way of looking at the world. So I'm going to begin by unpacking some key questions about art. Then I'm going to explore the utility of art for the state during periods of war. And then in the final part, I'm going to take this up into the modern day and talk about art as a means of self-expression and how individuals can put forward their own visions of war and what this means for modern society. I will hopefully allocate some time at the end for any questions, but do ask me if you want me to clarify any terms as I go along. Okay. So let's start with the very basic question. What can art tell us? Or why even bother looking at art? Many of us go through school looking at textbooks such as this one, and images serve as mere illustrations to the main text. I know that I certainly did when I was younger. I would read the text and this would almost just be a nice decoration I'd glance over. But images are important source materials and we should not ignore them. We can enhance them as a way of actually approaching these very complex issues. So art is actually an invented category in itself. What counts as art? If we look at this image, we could take the canon and we could say, is this art? Or perhaps some of you think that only the sculpture above it is art. Maybe both of them are art, but they can be on a sliding scale from not art to art. Or some would say that everything is art, so we can just give up. Well, with this question in mind, we can begin to consider which aspects of material culture, that is, the objects that we engage with as day-to-day living beings in the world, how these provide insight into conflict and war, and what this means for interpreting power. So let's focus on the role of the creator. A cannon is likely made in a factory. It's intended as an object to be used in a war or as a weapon. In contrast, the sculpture above is made as a sculpture. It's made to be an artwork. And in this way, it represents the belief of the artist, the intention that he wants to make art for art's sake. It's a message that he's trying to convey. In this way, art can be thought of as representing the belief of its creator. Now, let's think about this in terms of ideology. Ideology could be thought of as a system of ideas or ideals. So perhaps some of you are starting to piece together how if artworks constitute beliefs, they can kind of add into this quilt work of ideology. We can scale ideology from the micro, so from what the individual artist believes, what the artist who created this believed, why he was portraying it. And we can scale it right up to the macro, so ideologies such as communism and fascism, how the individual contributes to the whole of this. Historically, ideology could also constitute the belief that one leader had the divine right to rule. So, like a monarch, it would be the idea that he had the divine authority over his kingdom, and art could embellish and advertise this idea, helping to justify why one particular leader had the right to conquer another land. Art can make us feel. Ideology can make us take action. And art can make an idea more emotionally attractive, a bit like an advertisement for an idea. It can rouse the nationalistic sentiments within us, the flying of a flag, for example, or the anger within us to conquer injustice and inequality. The connection between the two is vital, and to understand ideology through words alone paints only one part of the picture. Art can communicate en masse. For people who cannot read your language, for example, they can see, say, a painting of who couldn't read French, could see the painting of Napoleon with the flag in the background, and they understand immediately the glory of war. This is powerful. Imagine centuries ago, with no technology, to be able to communicate in such a way to so many people. So, the debate about the aims and function of art goes back at least as far as Plato in the 4th century. So why do we make art? Plato saw a fabulous unreality in ordinary people's attempts to grasp the material world, to transform it on the canvas or in sculpture. Plato believed that art should be mimetic. And by this, I mean that art should accurately resemble reality, like a photograph does today. The word representation will come up a lot in this lecture. So by representational art or figurative art, I mean that the art depicts something realistically so that its subject is recognizable. So, for example, we can all look at this painting and see that it depicts grapes and a bird, because we can recognize those objects in reality. Renaissance artists working in the 14th to the 17th centuries were obsessed with a text by Pliny called Natural History. And this was from the 1st century AD, and it contained detailed descriptions of the great works of art from antiquity. It contained a mythic story about a competition between two figures. We have Xerxes, who's here, and Parrhasius, who's there. So hopefully that's not too blurry. And this story came from the 5th century BC, and it was a story to tell the power of mimetic art. So what happened is Xerxes painted a picture of grapes that was so successful, they were so realistic, that birds actually flew down to try and peck at the grapes. They thought they were real. So Xerxes was thinking, great, I won, I fooled the birds. But Parrhasius was one step ahead, because Xerxes said, okay, let me show me your work then. And then he went to pull back the curtain, only to find out that the curtain itself was a painting. So whereas Xerxes had fooled the birds, Parrhasius had fooled the artist at its own game. So representational art can be, as the aim of art, as the kind of highest power to resemble reality, can be contrasted to abstract art. Whereas we can recognize that what is depicted in these examples are grapes and bird and curtains, we cannot conclude with much confidence as to what William Turnbull is actually depicting in this canvas, in this relief. I suggested to you at the beginning of the lecture that it was a post-nuclear landscape, but really, if I hadn't have told you that, maybe you could have drawn some other conclusions. Does anyone see anything different? What do you think this depicts? Any ideas?
Destruction.
Destruction? Is everyone seeing the same kind of thing or anything different?
I was drawing earlier, so it might be someone just sketching geometric shapes as practice for drawing.
Yeah, exactly.
Shading, for example.
Yeah, so we can see this and see different things. For example, we could even see like ships on an ocean. And that contrast is a good contrast to the representational art. We do not know for certain what it depicts, and frankly, it does not matter, because abstract art is more interested in the relationship between you, the viewer, and the artwork itself, so what you see and what that means about you. But just because abstract art is non-representative, it doesn't mean that it can't be authentic. That is, that it can still evoke feelings within you, which you have felt before. So some might look at this painting and it might remind them of the time that they watched the news, for example, and saw some images of destruction, and it might kind of evoke the same sadness or, panic. And that's still an authentic feeling. So let's return to the role of the artist. An artist can be conceived as an author, as an individual who translates a faction of their experience into another form. The soldier working a cannon, for example, translates the reality to artwork. In this way, artists provide a different way of comprehending reality, a different perspective on war. And as human agents, we have to now think about a key message that I want us all to think about during this lecture of intentionality. So not just what does the artist depict, but why is he or she depicting it? And this is going to be key when we think of, as well, agents of power, so the state. Why does the state want the artist to depict something in a certain way? By asking these searching questions, we can unlock a source to see the past in a different way. War and conflict gets a human face. So just to summarize, we've got the connection between art and ideology, how that can be a human experience of war, but also questioning the role of intentionality. Why depict it in that way? So I'm now going to move on to the second part, to look at how art has been used as an instrument of the state. So let's think about art as constituting a form of mythic legitimacy or political propaganda. It is often said that history is written by winners, and perhaps the same can be said for art. Especially in the past, art often commemorated glorious victories so that they could be remembered for generations to come. They legitimized government and international law. The most famous example of this is the Bayeux Tapestry. It tells a story of the conquest of England by Duke of Normandy in 1066. The battle is told in relative detail. It contains about 58 scenes much like this one. It weaves together Christian fables and imagery to tell a noble Norman narrative of righteous conquest. We don't know who exactly commissioned the tapestry, but many historians believe that it was the brother of William the Conqueror, which would make sense, right, if the winners write the history. It was likely intended as a piece of political propaganda at a time when the Normans were facing a spout of Anglo-Saxon rebellions across England. It is a piece of persuasion for those who didn't speak English or read to convince them that the Duke from Normandy was the rightful heir to the English throne. Let's think about this in terms of scale as well. From this image, you can see it's incredibly large. It's 70 meters long. Now, only a winner would want to portray victory in such a way. Conflict is economically devastating for both the winners and the losers. But let's think about this in terms of the power of the arts. Despite this economic devastation, states and individuals continue to commission artists. Now that says something, right? If you haven't got much money left, instability, but art continues. The importance attributed to art by the state during periods of conflict can be thought of in relation to nationalism. The New York Literary Journal, the Knickerbocker, extolled at the start of the American Civil War, quote, "Artists, remember that your elegant brushes are recording the history of a nation," end quote. This can be interpreted in light of imperialism. Art could act as propaganda to promote international law as profoundly good or a virtuous mode of governance. Religious imagery and connotations was one way in which imperialism could be justified as virtuous. Prior to the 20th century, war artists were more likely to depict heroic tales rich in religious imagery. Napoleon on the Battlefield of Eylau by Antoine Jean Gros is an example of this. It depicts Napoleon as a compassionate, almost Christ-like figure visiting the corpse-strewn battlefield in eastern Prussia after a bloody French victory. We see another warrior on Napoleon's side, Joachim Murat, who looks very fierce and again glorious, a figure of strength. And like I said, Napoleon looks almost like Christ with his arm out as the defeated men kind of almost fall over and, show their allegiance to him. This is a way of legitimizing conquest, of suggesting that this was the righteous victory. People are actually volunteering themselves to the new emperor. One of the most famous artists associated with nationalist art at this time was Jacques-Louis David, who I introduced to you at the beginning of the lecture. So Napoleon crossing the Alps commemorates another glorious victory, the lightning raid on the North Italian states, winning a series of astonishing victories. In the painting, Napoleon masters a white war horse. It's very glamorous. But this is a lie. In reality, Napoleon actually crossed the Alps on a mule, on like a donkey, like a mule, which is, less cool, I guess. But David decided to create a myth. And with it, we've also got him pointing. Napoleon is pointing in the direction of progress. So, like the Bayeux Tapestry, it is propaganda for a political cause. And although it is a representative artwork, so we can read, for example, it's a horse, we can read the French flag, it represents in order to distort reality, myth-making in art. The political context for both artworks was the founding of a new period in history. Created in 1800 to 1801, Napoleon crossing the Alps signals the dawning of a new century, following the decade of terror and uncertainty sparked by the French Revolution in 1789. The painting is a depiction of a new leader, Napoleon, swathed in glory, a powerful leader for a bright new age. His mastering of the stallion suggests authority. He's mastering nature, a figure that is worthy to lead a country that has suffered in chaotic circumstances. The great civilizations of Western Europe, at least in the early stages, were founded based on success in war, and art was a means of expressing this official story. The word civilization itself implies the bringing of order, and through imperialism, this was done with force. The Romans, for example, were organized and ruthless in their fighting, constant fighting. And then without the tireless campaigning of Charlemagne in the 8th century, the former Holy Roman Emperor, we should never have had the notion of a united Europe, and within it the means for its disintegration. If we zoom in on this painting, on this corner, We can even see some names inscribed. We see the Latin for Charlemagne at the bottom, and then also Hannibal. These are two other figures, some heroes from history, who brought their men over the Alps to conquer a new land. So David is being very, very obvious in what he's doing here. He's not doing it very subtly. Bonaparte's name is right above it. Some might say that this nationalism is overkill. You know, David was going a bit too far for this. It was just too obvious. But he was really hitting this story home. Okay, so hopefully you're beginning to see the gap between truth and reality start to emerge here. And now I've got another example to do with treaty making. So this painting is called Penn's Treaty by American-British artist Benjamin West. Here, treaty making is given the central role as an instrument of power, benevolence, and peaceful international regulation. Viewers of the painting could believe in peaceful colonization. West depicts a gathering between William Penn and an indigenous group, the Lenni Lenape, that he imagined for taking place in 1682. It is likely, however, that this meeting did not actually happen. So this whole meeting is actually a myth. It's just an image to send back home to suggest that colonization was peaceful and also consensual. We can see, for example, the Lenni Lenape embrace European gifts as they're given gifts here to suggest that they're voluntarily kind of giving themselves to European civilization. Also, the artist used a neoclassical style, and by this I mean clarity of form. So, you know, the figures are very exact and the lines are very precise, with very strong horizontals and verticals. And the artist may have used a neoclassical style to suggest a political order, visual and political harmony, referencing the Roman past that I talked about, these great empires of order and imperialism. The neoclassical style also makes it timeless, so again fitting it in with the myth of history. The weapons of the Lenni Lenape lie on the ground to suggest them being welcomed into the fold of civilization. People back home in America and Britain, people back home in Britain could believe in the myth of peaceful colonization. Moreover, let's look at the scale of these works and think about that. I mentioned it briefly for the Bayeux Tapestry, but this piece in particular is 223 by 305 centimeters. It's massive. So this is a statement in itself. It implies wealth, stability, technical skills, and above all, the confidence necessary to push through a long-term project. War in these examples is a means for national success and glory. The embers of empire was cultivated within the canvas. And expressions of power can also be seen in architectural style. And this is another element of material culture, what we see by walking around us. Imperialism is represented by classical architecture. For example, the domes and the columns on the White House suggest the classical past, the bringing of order. We might see this as part of our culture in the West, but people outsiders looking at America might see this as evidence as the continuing nature of imperialism. Western culture is still imperial, they might say, by looking at the White House. And we can also think about these messages in terms of the National Gallery in London. If any of you have visited, the building is beautiful. The columns and the domes, it all gives a clear message about the art inside. This is the zenith of culture, the pinnacle of painting is contained within these walls. These are all clear messages of power and authority. So just to summarize, I've outlined how I've argued that art can be used as an instrument of the state. It can provide mythic legitimization, and In this way, it was used to convey the message that imperialism was natural. It was a natural law that was spreading in a very peaceful way. And then also in this way, we can think more simply of art as being political propaganda. Okay, so now we're going to move a bit more into the modern day. And we're going to think about art as a war as an ugly reality. We've seen how war's depicted as very beautiful and glorious, but artists don't always portray it in this way, and especially in modern times when it's used more as a means of self-expression. We can think about this transition in terms of the closing of the gap between myth and reality. So whereas the paintings by Napoleon paintings of Napoleon were the almost like official state media, what people at home wanted to believe the war was like, with the proliferation of newspapers and also the increasingly connected world and soldiers going into war and coming back and spreading the news more easily, this gap was closed. States began to think of art as more of a means of national record. And there was even a belief among some that great art was made during the war, and so the opportunity should be capitalized upon by states to create this canon. The English war artist C.R.W. Nevinson claimed that, quote, "There is no beauty except in strife, and no masterpiece without aggressiveness." Think back to the beginning of the lecture when I posed the question to you about the nature of art. Art as representative of human experience. It constitutes a form of emotional expression. Nevinson's claim relates to this understanding. Conflict heightens emotion, and art is made in the rough like a diamond. This understanding of masterpieces as related to beauty means that war must be the perfect opportunity to create great art. But this does not necessarily or frequently, war in itself, lead to beauty. When I think of war now, I think of ugliness. And so did William Turnbull, if we think back to the beginning. So it was beauty for Jacques-Louis David in terms of that it was a myth of glorious victory. Who in the modern age would now represent war through the lens of beauty? And I ask you this because some people still do. These questions were asked during World War I in Britain. At the same time, art slipped from the control of the educated elite, and artists were commissioned by the British government through the British War Memorials Committee. A primary aim of this scheme was to forge a record of war and the activities associated with it. Art commissioned by the state was no longer primarily intended to promulgate a national myth about divine authority, but rather to capitalize upon the opportunity to produce great art, with the confidence of Nevinson that masterpieces were forged during periods of strife. Thus, the committee aimed to enhance the resonance of the commissioned works through grandeur of scale. Various artists were commissioned to produce paintings that matched in size to Uccello's Battle of San Romano in the National Gallery in London, which is 182 by 320 centimetres. So I've included a little figure of a person to see, of someone my-ish height, to see how it would compare in the gallery. It was evoking the old master tradition of narrative painting for historical posterity to record the war. However, artists use these commissions not to make works of mythic aggrandizing, but rather to shatter such conceptions. They did this through a style of realism. By this, I mean the artist sought to represent what he or she saw as accurately as possible, and without pity. Thus, mythic alterations to form glorious narratives are avoided, and the artist wanted to depict what they saw so you could be the judge of war yourself. Even before the 20th century, though, artworks commissioned for national purposes were not the only type of images that circulated. So, the medical illustrator Charles Bell traded glory for gory in his sketches and watercolours of injured soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. As a surgeon, neurologist, and anatomist, Bell could accurately convey human suffering caused at the battle. These works were not intended to these works were intended to illustrate wounds and operative techniques in order to educate other surgeons. They were not commissioned by the state as works of art. And we can also take notice of the medium as well to think about this. So whereas the other paintings were oil paintings, this was made in watercolor. This was not meant to go on the wall of a national gallery. It was meant to educate other surgeons. Bell's ability to elicit empathy, and I know that this is true because when I brought this image up on the board, a lot of you looked at it and went, ugh. He could do this because he understood the anatomy of pain. He was very well studied. So remember the story about Xerxes and Parrhasius at the beginning, about the power of mimetic art? Well, Bell's images fit within this tradition, but he wasn't necessarily accurately representing reality to create art, but rather to educate other surgeons. Think about intention here, the why. What changed with World War I is that artists could produce realistic works on the scale of history paintings, so these massive canvases, which were previously reserved for religion and classical themes, all the while being commissioned by the state. Realism was put onto an epic scale. What would result? One of the artists commissioned was John Nash, who had first-hand experience of fighting in the war and therefore knew the human tragedy involved. So whilst fighting, he was commanded to lead a group of soldiers at Marcon in France in an effort to divert attention from a nearby bombing raid. And this canvas depicts this instance. During this journey, 68 out of the 80 men were killed. John Nash uses realism in this way to convey the tragedy that he experienced, the tragedy that he felt. It's an immediate reminder of an event that he would later describe as, in fact, pure murder. The work that was commissioned by the state for John Nash to produce is called Oppie Wood. And it also represents his direct experience, but on an even bigger scale. Again, note the size here is similar to Uccello's Battle of San Romano. The area of Oppie Wood had formed the no man's land between the opposing armies during World War I. He had been sent there to study the trench system as part of his training. And what results is a very eerie depiction of this terrible place. We have a coffin-like entrance going into the tunnels, whilst we have trees falling over each other in the top right-hand corner, almost like a crucifix. So what we get is the effect here of walking into your grave. This is what it felt for him. This was the real experience that he wanted to bring back home and to say to people, this isn't glorious. War is not glorious. You are walking into your death. Another commission by the British War Memorials Committee was by the brother of John Nash, called Paul Nash. Also having had experience fighting in the war, Paul Nash sought to be a messenger of bitter truth. His depiction of war is unforgiving in its stark realism. The commissioned work, The Men in Road, is a magisterial indictment of the devastation caused by war to the landscape, to the natural landscape. The message that I read when looking at this is, what have humans done to the world? How terrible. Its large size creates the sense of tragic scale, with the road and the landscape being potholed with craters and shells, whilst the verticals lead your eye in all different directions to suggest the unending nature of devastation. So I hope that you've noticed that the individual has slowly risen to the forefront of this lecture so far. No longer are artists just instruments of the state to depict the national myths, but also they're beginning to think about what they want to bring home from the war, what they want people to see. So let's return now to Nevinson, to his question, does art have to be beautiful? If war is an ugly reality, what are these images? It kind of hints at those larger philosophical questions which drives the history of art forward. If we are to represent war truthfully or accurately, then the resultant art is horrific. And here is this tension between mimesis, Plato's ideal, and beauty as the aim of art. In Paul Nash's work, this tension is expressed precisely. Accurate representation was the means to deglorify war. And Nash wrote in an angry letter to his wife that the war was, quote, unspeakable, godless, and hopeless. His horrors were so great that he no longer considered himself to be, quote, an artist interested and curious, but was instead a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever. Poets also joined in on this task, to debunk the mythic glory of war. Notice the imagery in Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. As in realism in art, Wilfred Owens describes the bloody reality of a chlorine gas attack in a way to disgust the listener. Dulce et decorum est pro patria more is the lie that the poem, like Charles Bell's illustrations, dispelled. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The emotional nature of such poetry, as in images, have an emotional immediacy, seeking to replicate the first-hand experience of war. The take-home message being that if any of us actually experienced war, none of us would glorify it ever again. Self-expression, however, need not be nihilistic, and periods of conflict are followed by peacetime, post-war. Whereas the Nash brothers portrayed war as ominous warnings to the future, some artists saw these ruined landscapes as exhilarating opportunities for renewal. A wounded city on the cusp of rebirth, spaces ripe for utopic visions. So, another British artist, Frank Auerbach, is an example of this. This painting, Oxford Street Building, Sci 1, is a monumental work, again, a very, very big canvas. Building sites in London were a favourite theme for Auerbach in the 1950s, and this painting was made whilst he was looking down on the area between Oxford Street and Cavendish Square, if any of you have visited London. Looking at this work on a screen fails to do it justice, and it really does. It looks incredibly flat on this screen, and I think, just unrelated to this lecture, you must go and see these works in person, as on a screen, artworks are just, poor representations. But in reality, the paint is very thick. We have very earthy tones, and you can just about make out on the screen the lines going across and up, which are meant for cranes. So what Auerbach does here is elevate the idea of reconstruction, post-war rebuilding, on a massive scale, to suggest that this is what should happen. We need to build a new world. And I promise in person this looks less gloomy. Part of this utopic vision, these utopic visions, were a counterpoint to the nationalistic sentiment depicted in earlier wartime art. The nationalistic sentiments, taken to an extreme to fascism and arguably communism, were widely believed to be a cause of war to unprecedented scales. Artists, no longer limited to the task of accurate representation or to state patrons, became gods in themselves, putting forward visions for a new society through art. Some would say democracy in practice. If nationalism led to war in the past, and war artists had previously contributed and ignited these nationalistic sentiments, what could artists do to build a peaceful society? Well, 20th century British artist Victor Passmore thought about this question directly. He began his career as a figurative painter, so we can see here the wall and the trees that we can recognize. But World War II really changed him, and he moved in further and further to the abstract. So we can see the same image, the same scene depicted in two different styles. Why did he do this? What was his intention? Well, Passmore was a visionary. He wanted to put forward a way to construct society post-war. So rather than abstracting from real life by taking this tree, for example, and making it into lines, as how we started out, he wanted to actually construct from first principles, so from ideas. So sorry, Francisco, for including such abstract art, but the idea between this constructivist style of art is that it's recognized by all. You don't need to have knowledge of a flag, for example, but you could take this to somewhere in a very, the farthest corner of the earth, and people would recognize the same colors, the same shapes. It's a universal language. And this school he called constructivist art, this style. Working in the 1950s, Passmore put together a circle of younger artists who would construct art in this way. Art was an ideology for the future, but importantly, it's an inflection of the earlier Napoleonic art. Artists are no longer reliant on the state patrons, but they are putting forward these ways forward themselves. So we always need to keep an eye on, with artists putting forward a vision of society, a better society, but better for whom? So to conclude, in this lecture, I've argued for the importance of art for the study of war and conflict, based on the notion that artworks can spread ideology and represent the human or emotional experience of war. We move from the mythic to the realistic, the representative as a way to glorify art in a mythic way, but then also how artists thought as artists themselves, as subjective entities, to portray what they wanted, to think about how the viewer in this relationship should react to war itself. Now we live in an age of image saturation. So TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, these platforms all bring the reality of war back home. We no longer have to visit galleries such as the National Gallery to see the Battle of San Romano. We're at home, we can look at these images on our phone. But, as I hope I've highlighted, realistic art is still not truthful. It's a decision of the artist. So, as I said, we always need to think about better for whom. Image representation continues to be representation by someone intended for something. So I'm going to leave you with that thought and welcome any questions.